Cold stone leaches the warmth from her bare feet. A heavy timber door groans on wrought iron hinges, rattling the frost on the window panes. He stands there massive, smelling of damp pine needles and raw earth. The silence stretches, thick and suffocating, before his low, chest-deep voice breaks it. "Don't hide from me." The courtyard of Oakhaven Keep was a mire of freezing mud and crushed straw. Rowena stood by the wagon, the hem of her woolen travel cloak heavy with gray sludge. Her breath plumed in the frigid twilight, quick and shallow. She was shivering, though she refused to wrap her arms around herself. That would be an admission of frailty, and she had promised herself she would not give the Northern Pack any more weaknesses to document. She was an Omega. Her biology was already a recorded weakness, a commodity traded for a border treaty and 300 barrels of grain. Men with broad shoulders and thick, unkempt beards moved around her, hauling crates from the wagons. They smelled like wet wool, horse sweat, and the sharp, musky undertone of the wolf. None of them looked at her directly. They kept their heads dipped, a gesture of instinctual deference that made Rowena's stomach turn sour. They deferred to her not out of respect, but because she now belonged to him, Conrad. She expected the Lycan King to receive her in a great hall, seated on some carved wooden chair, draped in furs and dripping with arrogant authority. Instead, she found him by the stables. He was scraping mud off his boots with a rusted iron trowel. Rowena stopped 10 paces away. The captain of the guard, a burly man named Auric, cleared his throat. Conrad didn't look up immediately. He finished knocking the heavy clumps of clay from his heel, tossed the trowel onto a hay bale, and straightened. He was absurdly tall. The ceiling of the stable overhang seemed to press down on him. He wore no crown, only a battered leather tunic over a linen shirt that had seen better days. A thick, jagged scar pulled at the left side of his jaw, disappearing into a dark, close-cropped beard. He looked exhausted. The deep lines around his pale, amber eyes spoke of chronic sleeplessness, and his shoulders slumped slightly under an invisible weight. "You're late," Conrad said. His voice was a physical thing, a deep baritone that vibrated against Rowena's sternum. "The roads in the valley were washed out, my lord," Auric answered, bowing his head. Conrad waved a hand dismissively, his gaze finally shifting to Rowena. She braced herself. She expected the predatory once-over, the sizing up of his new broodmare. Instead, his eyes dropped to her freezing, mud-soaked leather shoes, then up to her blue-tinged lips. A muscle twitched in his ruined jaw. "Get her inside," Conrad muttered, turning his back on her. "Give her hot water. She looks like she's about to shatter." He didn't wait for a response. He walked away, his heavy footfalls splashing through the puddles, leaving Rowena standing in the freezing rain. She felt a sharp spike of irritation pierce through her terror. Shatter. She wasn't glass. She was just cold. The keep was cavernous and drafty. The stone walls sweat with moisture, and the fires in the hearths seemed to produce more stinging wood smoke than heat. Several older women betas, judging by their steady, unimposing scents, stripped Rowena of her ruined traveling clothes and scrubbed her with coarse soap that smelled of lye and crushed lavender. They dressed her in a heavy linen nightshift and a thick woolen shawl, then deposited her in the king's bedchamber. The door shut behind her with a heavy, final thud. A heavy iron latch fell into place on the outside. Rowena stood perfectly still. The room was sparse. A massive bed carved from dark oak dominated the center, covered in a mountain of furs. A single hearth crackled feebly on the far wall. There was a washstand, a heavy wooden table, and a deep alcove by the narrow, arched window. She gravitated toward the window. The cold radiating from the glass was familiar. It grounded her. She pulled her knees to her chest, pressing her back against the rough stone of the alcove, and waited. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing red embers. The keep grew completely silent, save for the whistling wind outside. Rowena's eyelids grew heavy, her exhaustion fighting a bitter war with her adrenaline. Then, the latch lifted. The door opened, and Conrad ducked his head to enter. He had washed. The scent of dirt and horses was gone, replaced by the clean smell of cold air and pine soap. He wore only woolen trousers. In the dim light, his chest and arms were a map of pale scars, white slashes across thick, corded muscle. He locked the door behind him and turned. He didn't look at the bed. He looked straight at the dark corner where she crouched. Lycan eyesight. He could see her perfectly. Rowena pressed herself harder against the stone. Her heart hammered a frantic bird-like rhythm against her ribs. This was the moment. The treaty was signed, the grain was delivered, and now the consummation was required to seal it. Conrad walked slowly toward the center of the room. He stopped near the dying fire, staring at the embers. He ran a large, calloused hand over his face, letting out a breath that sounded more like a sigh than a growl. He picked up a heavy gray wolf pelt from the foot of the bed. Without a word, he walked toward her alcove. Rowena flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, her hands balling into fists. She felt the sudden, radiating heat of his massive body block the meager draft from the window. She braced for the heavy hands, for the brutal reality of her new life. Instead, something soft and heavy settled over her trembling shoulders. She opened her eyes. Conrad had draped the fur over her. He was standing close enough that she could smell the clean sweat on his skin, but his hands were already pulling back. "The stone will leach the heat right out of your bones," he said quietly. Rowena stared at his chest, unable to meet his eyes. "I am fine." Her voice was hoarse, raspy from the cold and disuse. Conrad lingered for a second longer. He looked down at her, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. "Don't hide from me," he growled softly, the timbre of his voice catching on the silence of the room. It wasn't a command. It sounded, frustratingly, like a plea. He turned away, walked to the far side of the massive bed, and lay down on top of the covers. Within minutes, the deep, rhythmic sound of his breathing filled the room. Rowena stayed in the corner. She pulled the fur tightly around her neck. It smelled intensely of him, pine, rain, and the dark, musky scent of a predator. It was terrifying. It was also the warmest thing she had felt in weeks. Days bled into a monotonous, gray routine. Oakhaven Keep was not a place of leisure or courtly intrigue. It was a working fortress, struggling to stockpile enough meat and firewood to survive the brutal northern winter that was fast approaching. Rowena was largely left to her own devices. The packwomen were polite but distant. They recognized her status as queen, but they also recognized her scent, an unmated omega, frightened and solitary. In wolf culture, a frightened pack member was a disruption. They didn't know how to handle her, so they brought her meals of roasted venison, sharp cheese, and coarse black bread, and left her alone. She spent her days exploring the narrow, twisting corridors of the keep, learning which floorboards groaned and which stairwells held the bitterest drafts. She learned to stay out of the way. Conrad was a ghost during the daylight hours. He was constantly riding out with patrols, hunting, or settling border disputes with neighboring clans. Rowena only saw him when the sun set and the heavy iron latch of their bedchamber fell into place. Their nights settled into a strange, agonizing dance. He would enter, smelling of the forest and frost. He would wash at the basin, the splashing water loud in the quiet room. Rowena would already be in her corner by the window, wrapped in the gray wolf pelt. Conrad never demanded she move. He never touched her. But the tension in the room was a living, breathing thing. One evening, nearly a month into her tenure at the keep, the winter broke in earnest. A blizzard slammed into the fortress, howling like a wounded animal against the stone. The temperature inside the bedchamber plummeted. Rowena huddled in her alcove, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. Conrad entered later than usual. He was covered in snow, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He stripped off his frozen tunic and tossed it near the hearth. He piled 3 massive logs onto the fire, stirring the embers until a roaring blaze finally caught. He didn't go to the bed. He pulled a heavy oak chair close to the hearth and sat down, staring into the flames. Rowena watched him from her shadow. She noted the way the firelight caught the amber in his eyes, making them look almost molten. She noted the exhausted slump of his spine. Suddenly, he spoke without turning around. "You're freezing." "I am managing," she lied. Her voice shook. Conrad turned his head. "Your lips are blue, Rowena. I can smell the cold on you from across the room. I can hear your teeth." She stiffened. "I prefer the window." "You prefer to be as far away from me as the walls allow," he corrected gently. He stood up. Rowena instantly pressed herself back into the stone. The panic was automatic, a physiological response she couldn't control. Conrad stopped in the center of the room. He ran a hand through his damp hair. A low rumble started in his chest, a sound of pure frustration. "I have not touched you. I have not asked anything of you. I sleep on the edge of the mattress, so you have the whole bed, and yet you sleep on the floor like a beaten dog." "I am an omega traded for grain," Rowena snapped, the sudden flare of anger surprising them both. "Do not pretend this is a courtship, my lord. I know what I am here for. I am just waiting for you to take it." The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Conrad's expression darkened. The human exhaustion in his eyes vanished, replaced by the sharp, terrifying intensity of the Lycan. He closed the distance between them, in 2 massive strides. Rowena shrank back, throwing her arms up defensively. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, waiting for him to drag her to the bed by her hair. Silence. She opened her eyes slowly. Conrad was kneeling on the stone floor, a foot away from her. He was large enough that, even kneeling, he was nearly at her eye level. His hands were braced on his thighs, his knuckles white. "Look at me," he commanded. She forced herself to meet his eyes. They were wide, the pupils blown dark. "I am not a butcher," he said, his voice rough, scraping against the back of his throat. "I agreed to the trade because your father's lands were starving, and my pack needed the Western Pass secured. I did not buy a slave." He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement. Rowena flinched, but forced herself to stay still. He didn't touch her skin. His thick fingers grasped the edges of the gray pelt she was wrapped in, pulling it tighter around her. "You are my wife," he said softly. "You are the queen of this keep, but you look at me like I am a monster." "You are a Lycan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Lycans take what they want." "I am a man," Conrad countered, his jaw tight. "And I want my wife to sleep in a bed. I want her to stop shivering." He stood up and stepped back, leaving the path to the bed clear. "The fire is warm. The mattress is stuffed with fresh down. Use it." He walked past her, retrieved his frozen tunic from the floor, and sat in the chair by the hearth. He didn't look at her again. Rowena stayed in her corner for a long time. The floorboards were like ice. Her toes were completely numb. She looked at the massive bed, then at the man sitting in the chair, his back to her, staring into the flames. Slowly, awkwardly, she stood up. She kept the pelt wrapped tightly around her as she padded across the room. She climbed into the massive bed, sinking into the thick down mattress. It was absurdly soft. It smelled of dried sage and his deep pine scent. She lay on the far edge, facing the wall. Hours later, long after the fire had burned low, she heard the chair creak. Footsteps approached the bed. She held her breath. The mattress dipped on the opposite side. Conrad lay down, keeping a vast expanse of blankets between them. In the dark, his voice drifted across the space, quiet and tired. "Don't hide from me, Rowena. Please." She didn't answer. But, for the first time since she arrived at Oakhaven, she unclenched her fists and let herself sleep. The turning point did not come with a grand gesture. It came with the metallic stench of copper. It was mid-afternoon, 2 weeks after the blizzard. The keep was restless. A pack of feral rogues had been spotted near the southern ridge, harassing the lumber camps. Conrad had ridden out before dawn with 20 of his best fighters. Rowena was sitting in the great hall, mending a tear in one of her woolen shifts. The repetitive motion of the needle was soothing. The keep was quiet, the women working in hushed tones, their ears pricked for the sound of returning horses. Just before dusk, the heavy oak doors of the hall slammed open. A gust of freezing wind swept through the room, bringing with it the scent of wet iron, sweat, and blood. Rowena dropped her sewing. Conrad walked in. He was leaning heavily on Auric, his face chalk white beneath a layer of grime. A crude, blood-soaked bandage was wrapped tightly around his right thigh, but the dark crimson stain was spreading fast, dripping steadily onto the stone floor. The hall erupted into chaotic motion. Packed betas rushed forward with fresh linen and hot water. Auric helped Conrad to a long wooden table, easing him down onto a bench. Rogue got a lucky swipe. Auric grunted to the keep's healer, a frail old woman named Greta. Claws caught him deep. Bleeding won't stop. Rowena stood frozen by the hearth. Instinct screamed at her to flee, to retreat to her silent, empty bedchamber and hide under the furs. She hated blood. She hated the visceral, violent reality of Lycan life. She watched Greta unwrap the makeshift bandage. The wound was horrific. 4 deep, jagged trenches carved into the thick muscle of Conrad's thigh. The flesh was torn and messy. Conrad didn't make a sound, but his breathing was shallow, his eyes squeezed shut. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard, the wood splintered beneath his claws. "I need yarrow," Greta muttered, her hands shaking as she tried to apply pressure to the spurting wound, and spiderwebs to clot it. "We are out of yarrow. There is dried yarrow in my travel trunk," Rowena heard herself say. The entire hall went dead silent. Everyone turned to look at her. Even Conrad opened his eyes, squinting through the pain to find her by the fire. Rowena's face burned, but she didn't retreat. "My mother packed it. I will get it." She ran up the spiral stairs, her heart hammering in her throat. She dug through her trunk, her hands trembling as she bypassed the fine silks and linens she had never worn, finding the small leather pouch of medicinal herbs at the bottom. When she returned to the hall, the smell of blood was overwhelming. Her stomach pitched, a wave of nausea washing over her. She forced herself to walk to the table. She handed the pouch to Greta. "Thank you, my queen," the old woman breathed, quickly crushing the dried flowers into a paste with hot water. Rowena stepped back, intending to return to the shadows, but she caught sight of Conrad's hand. He had released the table. His hand hung limply at his side, trembling, coated in a mixture of snow and his own blood. He looked incredibly vulnerable. The Lycan King, the monster of the north, looked like a wounded man trying desperately not to show his pack how much agony he was in. Without thinking, Rowena stepped closer. She reached out and placed her small, pale hand over his large, bloody one. Conrad flinched violently at her touch. His head snapped toward her, his amber eyes wide and feral. For a split second, the wolf was right at the surface, wild and cornered. A low, terrifying snarl rumbled in his throat. Rowena's instinct screamed at her to pull away, to run. But she looked at the deep lines around his eyes, the exhausted slump of his shoulders, and she remembered the man who had knelt on the cold stone floor and begged her not to treat him like a butcher. She didn't pull away. She tightened her grip, her thumb pressing firmly against the back of his knuckles. "Steady," she whispered. Conrad stared at her. The feral light in his eyes flickered, then dimmed. The snarl died in his throat. He let out a long, shuddering breath and turned his face away, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. Slowly, his massive fingers curled inward, lightly wrapping around her hand. He didn't squeeze. He just held on, anchoring himself to her touch. Greta packed the wound with the yarrow paste and bound it tightly with clean linen. Conrad barely twitched. An hour later, Auric and another guard helped Conrad up the stairs to their bedchamber. Rowena followed. They laid him on the bed, stoked the fire, and left, closing the heavy iron latch behind them. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the logs. Rowena stood by the wash basin. She poured hot water from the kettle into the bowl and picked up a clean rag. She walked over to the bed. Conrad was lying on his back, his eyes closed. The firelight cast deep shadows over the hollows of his cheeks. He looked exhausted to his very marrow. Rowena sat on the edge of the mattress. She dipped the rag in the hot water, wrung it out, and gently wiped the dried blood and dirt from his jaw, careful of the old scar. Conrad's eyes fluttered open. He watched her hand as she moved the rag down his neck, cleaning the grime from his collarbone. "You hate the sight of blood," he said, his voice raspy. "I do," she agreed softly. "Yet you are here. You are bleeding on my clean sheets," she deflected, though her tone lacked any real bite. Conrad's lips twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on him. He reached up, his movements sluggish, and caught her wrist. His thumb lightly stroked the racing pulse point beneath her pale skin. "You didn't flinch," he murmured, "down in the hall, when I snarled. You didn't pull away. You were in pain. I am a beast, Rowena. When I am hurt, the beast is in control." He looked at her intently, his thumb still making slow circles on her wrist. "You should have been terrified." Rowena looked down at his hand holding hers. The contrast was stark, his skin tanned, scarred, and massive. Hers pale, fragile, and smooth. "I was terrified," she admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. She met his eyes, letting him see the honest, raw contradiction inside her. "But I realized something. You are more afraid of hurting me than I am of being hurt." Conrad's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, dropping his head back against the pillow. A deep tremor ran through his heavy frame. He didn't say anything, but he didn't let go of her wrist. Rowena gently pulled her arm free, only to rinse the rag in the basin. When she returned, she didn't sit on the edge of the mattress. She climbed under the thick furs, settling into the space beside him. She kept a cautious distance, careful not to jostle his injured leg, but she was close enough to feel the intense heat radiating from his body. Conrad turned his head to look at her. The firelight caught the quiet astonishment in his eyes. She pulled the blankets up to her chin, staring at the canopy above. "I am not hiding," she whispered into the dark room. Conrad shifted slightly, moving an inch closer. The scent of pine and raw earth washed over her, warm and protective. "No," he growled softly, the sound rumbling deep and contented in his chest. "You're not." Healing for a Lycan was a violent, ugly process. It did not involve quiet days of restful slumber. It demanded fuel, heat, and an agonizing metabolic surge that left the body trembling and drenched in sweat. By the third day, the fever took hold. The bedchamber became an oven. Conrad radiated a dry, blistering heat that baked the cold moisture out of the stone walls. He tossed furiously in the massive oak bed. The thick furs kicked to the floor, his broad chest slick with sweat and heaving. The clean scent of pine was gone, replaced by the sour tang of sickness and the sharp, metallic odor of his body warring against the rogue's venom. Rowena did not retreat to her window alcove. The draft was too bitter, and the man on the bed was too loud. She stood by the washstand, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her fingers were pruned from the constant wringing of linens in a basin of freezing snow water. She approached the bed cautiously. Conrad was caught in a delirium, his jaw clenched, low, guttural snarls vibrating in the back of his throat. His eyes darted beneath pale, sweat-soaked lids. He was fighting battles she couldn't see. She laid the icy cloth across his burning forehead. Conrad flinched violently. His hand shot out, thick fingers wrapping around her wrist with crushing force. Rowena gasped, her knees hitting the edge of the mattress. The grip was a vice of muscle and bone. She looked at his face. His amber eyes were open, but they were unseeing, clouded with fever and feral panic. He bared his teeth, a raw, animalistic threat rumbling through the quiet room. Panic flared in her chest. The sheer, overwhelming strength of him was a terrifying reminder of what he was. She was an omega. Her biology commanded her to submit, to cower, to let the apex predator dictate the terms of her survival. "Conrad," she choked out, her voice tight. He didn't blink. The snarl deepened. His thumb pressed painfully against the fragile bones of her wrist. "I am not a butcher." The memory of his voice, rough and desperate, cut through the haze of her terror. Rowena stopped pulling away. She forced her body to go entirely limp. She leaned closer, her free hand coming up to press flat against the center of his chest, right over his frantic, hammering heart. "Conrad," she said again. Her voice was remarkably steady, though her hands shook. "It is Rowena. You are in your keep. The fire is lit." She traced the shape of his collarbone with her thumb, a slow, grounding rhythm. "Don't hide," she whispered, throwing his own plea back at him. "Come back." The clouded amber of his eyes shifted. The wild, unthinking violence slowly receded, replaced by profound confusion, and then agonizingly slow recognition. He looked at her hand on his chest, then at his own hand crushing her wrist. He released her instantly, as if her skin burned him. A ragged groan tore from his throat. He turned his head away, squeezing his eyes shut. "Get out," he rasped, his voice a broken ruin. "Rowena, get out of the room." "No." She dipped the cloth back into the freezing basin. "I could have snapped your arm," he argued, his chest rising and falling in harsh, uneven gasps. He didn't look at her. The shame rolling off his scent was suffocating a bitter, ashy smell that made Rowena's stomach ache. "When the fever spikes, the wolf is blind. I cannot promise your safety." Rowena wrung out the cloth. The dripping water sounded like a ticking clock in the heavy silence. She walked back to the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning under their combined weight. "You did not snap my arm," she said simply. She reached out and firmly placed the cold rag over his eyes, blinding him entirely. Conrad stiffened. "You are a terrible patient, my lord," Rowena continued, her tone conversational, though her pulse still raced. She began to wipe the sweat from his shoulders with a dry towel. "You sulk. You growl at Greta when she brings the willow bark, and you smell like a wet dog." A beat of silence passed. Then, a short, breathy sound escaped him. It was a laugh, broken and exhausted, but real. His heavy shoulders slumped into the mattress. "A wet dog," he repeated blindly. "It is quite offensive," she lied, her thumb brushing against the unscarred side of his jaw. For the next 4 days, they lived in a strange, isolated purgatory. The blizzard raged outside, burying Oakhaven Keep in 4 feet of snow, effectively sealing them in. Rowena slept in the bed beside him. When his fever spiked and the nightmares came, she did not run. She learned the exact pressure needed to ground him, without triggering his defensive instincts. She learned that the ferocious Lycan King was afraid of drowning, a secret he confessed in a fever haze one midnight. And Conrad learned that his fragile, terrified Omega bride possessed a spine forged of cold iron. By the 5th morning, the fever broke. Rowena woke to the sound of shifting timber. The fire had died down to glowing embers. She was lying on her side, tangled in the heavy down quilt. She felt a weight against her back. Conrad was awake. He was no longer lying on the far edge of the mattress. He had closed the distance in the night. His chest was pressed lightly against her spine, his breathing deep and even. The heat radiating from him was no longer the sickly burn of fever, but the steady, comforting furnace of a healthy lichen. Slowly, carefully, a heavy arm draped over her waist. Rowena stopped breathing. She waited for the panic. She waited for the instinctual urge to scramble away, to put distance between herself and the massive predator currently caging her against the mattress. It didn't come. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of anchor. The heavy weight of his arm was a tether. She let out a long, quiet breath and leaned back, letting her shoulders rest against his chest. Conrad's breath hitched. The arm around her waist tightened incrementally, pulling her flush against him. He buried his face in the thick waves of her hair, inhaling deeply. "You smell like dried sage," he murmured, his morning voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated straight through her ribs. "And smoke." "I have been trapped in a room with a dying fire and a sweating Lycan," she answered softly. "I doubt I smell like anything pleasant." "You smell like mine," he corrected. It wasn't a demand. It was a quiet, almost awed realization. Rowena closed her eyes. The cold draft from the window curled across the floorboards, but inside the bed, wrapped in the dark, musky scent of pine and earth, she was entirely warm. The quiet between them was a fragile thing, easily broken by the brutal reality of the north. 2 days after the fever broke, the warning horn blew. It was a single, long blast that vibrated the frost-coated glass in its lead framing, sharp enough to rattle the teeth in Rowena's skull. Conrad froze mid-stride. He had been pacing the heavy oak floorboards, restless, his bandaged thigh pulling tight. In an instant, the lingering exhaustion of his sickness vanished. His spine straightened. His scent, previously soft pine and sweat, sharpened into something metallic, ozone-laced, and lethal. Without a word, he grabbed his broadsword from the corner. He didn't bother with a tunic, the cold air biting at the pale scars on his bare back. "Bar the door," he ordered, not looking back. His voice was flat, empty of the tentative warmth they had shared. "Open it, for no one but me." Rowena scrambled from the hearth. She grabbed the heavy iron latch the second he cleared the threshold, dropping it into the iron cradle with a loud, final clack. Silence returned to the room, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant, muffled sounds of the keep waking to violence. Shouts echoed from the courtyard. The rhythmic scraping ring of steel against steel filtered through the thick walls. Rowena paced the length of the bed, her bare toes curled against the freezing floorboards. The smell of fear began to seep into the room from the corridors outside, the acrid, sour scent of the keep's inhabitants hiding in the cellars. Then, a new sound cut through the ambient noise. Thud. It came from the window. Rowena stopped. She stared at the narrow, arched alcove. Thud. A wet, heavy scraping sound followed, like thick nails dragging across slate. The window was 3 stories up. The stone face of the keep was sheer, coated in ice. Before she could move, the glass shattered inward. A gale of freezing wind and pulverized snow exploded into the room, violently flipping the heavy tapestries against the walls. A massive shape hauled itself through the ruined stone frame. It was a rogue Lycan. The beast was an anatomical nightmare, emaciated to the point of structural failure. Its ribs jutted sharply against matted, dirt-stained gray fur. Saliva froze in thick stalactites from its black jowls. It didn't look around the room. Its hollow, pitch-black eyes locked instantly onto Rowena. It smelled her. The clean, soft scent of an unprotected omega. Food. A wet, clicking snarl rolled from its throat. Rowena's body betrayed her. Her biology screamed for submission, freezing the blood in her veins. She couldn't run. Her legs felt packed with wet sand. The rogue lunged, clearing the alcove in a single desperate bound. Blind panic finally short-circuited her paralysis. Rowena threw herself to the right, crashing hard into the stone hearth. The beast's jaws snapped shut on empty air with the force of a bear trap, its heavy claws gouging deep, splintering trenches into the oak floorboards where she had just stood. Rowena scrambled backward, her palms slipping on the slick mixture of snow and ash. Her right hand blindly connected with the cold, heavy iron of the fireplace poker. She gripped it with both hands and swung. It wasn't a heroic strike. It was a desperate, uncoordinated heave. The heavy iron grazed the side of the rogue's skull with a dull thunk. It barely fazed the creature. The beast shook its head, spraying dark, foul-smelling blood across the pale stone wall, and sprang again. This time, it caught her. Massive, heavy paws slammed into her shoulders, pinning her flat to the floorboards. All the oxygen evacuated her lungs. The poker clattered uselessly out of reach. The stench of rotting meat and infected gums washed over her face as the rogue opened its jaws, aiming straight for her throat. Rowena squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't breathe. She just waited for the teeth. Behind her, the heavy oak door exploded. The iron latch tore through the timber, raining splinters across the room. A roar shook the very foundation of the keep, a sound so loud, so devoid of anything human, that it vibrated the fluid in Rowena's ears. The crushing weight was violently ripped from her chest. Rowena gasped, rolling onto her side, coughing violently. Through watering eyes, she watched the carnage. Conrad had taken the rogue mid-air. He hadn't brought his sword. He was tearing the beast apart with his bare hands. It was a slaughter. Fast, brutal, and sickeningly wet. He was a blur of corded muscle and savage violence, snapping bone and tearing matted fur with a terrifying lack of hesitation. Bright crimson painted the floor, mixing with the white snow blowing through the window. A final, decisive crunch echoed off the walls. The rogue went limp. The room plunged into an eerie quiet, save for the howling wind. Conrad stood over the ruined corpse. He was soaked in blood, his bare chest heaving with ragged, frantic breaths. Thick, dark claws extended from his knuckles. Slowly, his broad shoulders rising and falling, he turned to face her. His eyes were glowing. They were no longer amber. They were molten, terrifying gold. The absolute apex predator. He stared at her, taking in her torn linen shift, her trembling hands, her pale face pressed against the stone. He saw her looking at him. He saw her seeing the monster. The gold in his eyes flickered, warring with a deep, crushing human sorrow. Conrad looked down at his blood-soaked hands. He took a slow step backward, moving toward the broken door, retreating from her. "No," Rowena choked out. Her voice was gravelly, weak, but it anchored him to the floorboards. Rowena pushed herself up. Her knees shook so violently she almost collapsed again. She wiped a mixture of ash and snow from her cheek. She didn't look away from him. She stepped around the mangled corpse. She stepped through the spreading pool of blood. She stopped inches from his massive, heaving chest. The scent of copper and death was overpowering, but beneath it, she could smell his terror. "You're shaking," Conrad rasped, his voice a broken, inhuman growl. "I am terrified," Rowena answered, her jaw tight, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "But I am not hiding." She reached out, ignoring the slick blood coating his skin, and pressed her palms flat against his chest. Conrad's eyes squeezed shut. A fractured, desperate sound tore from his throat. He dropped to his knees on the bloody floorboards, wrapping his massive arms around her waist, burying his face in the soft linen over her stomach. He held her like a starving man, breathing in the scent of her skin, grounding himself in the steady, defiant rhythm of her racing heart. Rowena tangled her fingers in his dark, damp hair, holding him tight against the freezing wind. Thank you for watching the dramatic conclusion of Don't Hide From Me. If this raw and grounded werewolf romance captured your heart, please drop a like and share the video with your friends to help our channel grow. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another immersive story. Leave a comment below letting us know your favorite sensory detail or emotional moment from Rowena and Conrad's journey.